Is our third meeting, and this year, at least, our last, on the subject of Joseph and his brothers. It isn't so surprising that we're spending so much time speaking about them, considering that more or less, almost the last third of the book of Genesis concerns Joseph and his brothers. The past two sessions, we considered what the underlying motivations were and what the lessons were that we could learn from the conduct, the wrongdoings of all of the principles in this tale. This evening, as our final meeting on the subject of Genesis, I'd like to consider the story of Joseph and his brothers in terms of the final conclusions and the implications not only in our understanding their actions, but, as we shall see, also in understanding our actions, our decisions, and ultimately God's decisions. In order to get a sense of what the issues are, we consider first two statements of Joseph that are nothing if not bewildering. Indeed, rather tantalizing and even, it would seem, a bit incomprehensible. First, as a kind of introduction to our discussion, I'd like to consider Genesis chapter 45. In Genesis chapter 45, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. He discloses his true identity. Joseph said unto his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father yet live? And his brothers couldn't answer him because they were affrighted at his presence. Whereupon Joseph speaks to them in reassuring terms. He says to his brothers, come near to me, I pray you. They come near. He said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold to Egypt. And now comes the surprising switch. And now be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me here. Now, of course, by all logic, they should indeed be grieved, and they should be angry with themselves. Because after all, this is what they did. They committed what is unequivocally a grievous sin. But Joseph says, God sent me before you to preserve life. On the most immediate plane, because there are 7 years of famine, of which only 2 have thus far passed, and God sent me before you to give you a remnant on the earth, to save you alive for a great deliverance. So, who made the decisions? Joseph's brothers or God? And of course, inevitably, the implications. Who does make decisions in this world? And who bears responsibility for what happens in this world? The next verse is most telling of all. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. God. So God's responsible. And does this then serve as any sort of acquittal, exoneration of the brothers for what they had done? Indeed, tantalizing, an enigma. Joseph doesn't explain, but we need to try to explain. What in the world is going on here? We've spent so much time considering what was done, the crime that was perpetrated. And now it's all on God's account, and everyone else is scot-free, off the hook. Very strange indeed. Now, I stated at the outset that we would consider two statements by Joseph. The second is practically at the end of the book of Genesis, in chapter 50. And in a way, it is both more tantalizing and more global in its scope. Here, the context is, after Joseph and his brothers return from the burial of their father, the brothers said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and will fully requite us all the evil that we did to him. And that, of course, is a point of great concern, because they did evil. They say it. Of course, as we noted back in chapter 42, when they first consider the burden of their guilt, when they have difficulties with the unknown, thus far anonymous, ruler of Egypt, they say, we are guilty. Over what? Over not having heard our brother's pleas. At that stage, as we noted, there wasn't any implication that they actually regretted having done what they did. Just they felt in retrospect that they should have done what they did in a less hard-hearted manner. Well, at this point, this is, after all, after around 17 years have elapsed since their initial encounter with Joseph and his disclosure of his identity. At this point, they recognize we did evil. We were wrong. All the evil we did to him. And they're concerned that they may have to pay. And so they sent a message to Joseph, ascribing it to their father. So shall you say to Joseph, forgive, I pray you now, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for that they did to you was evil. Note, it was a transgression. It was sin. It was evil. No ambiguities here, right? And they add, now we pray, forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Again, transgression. No question. And as further amplification of their contrition, they fall down before Joseph. They offer themselves as bondmen before him. And Joseph replies, fear not, for am I in the place of God? Well, okay, that much we can understand, right? He's not. But then he states the following. And as for you, well, the phrase that then follows in the Hebrew is, V'atem chashavtem alai ra'ah. Our translation renders that as, you meant evil against me. As we will note over the course of our discussion this evening, The words in the Hebrew may alternatively be understood as you considered me evil. That is, evil against you. In much the same vein that when Joseph came to his brothers way back when he was 17 years old, and they are described in the Torah as vayitnaklu oto lahamito, and we noted the preposition following the verb may imply that rather than plotting against him, they ascribed to him plotting against them. Here too could be, rather than you meant evil against me, you considered me evil against you. Be that as it may, either way, you did something that you yourselves describe as all the evil we did to him, the transgression, the sin. Pretty straightforward here. But God meant it for good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. What is that supposed to mean? And should be construed as in any way excusing the brother's action? Of course, these questions are central to what we are to learn from the story of Joseph and his brothers, and we'll do our best to try to resolve them as well as we can over the course of our meeting this evening. Before we consider that, though, I think it's important for us to consider what's at stake here. What I mean by that is, God meant it for good to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive, on the most obvious, immediate plane, very much as we already saw Joseph stated all those years earlier, approximately 17, when he disclosed his true identity to his brothers and bid them not to be angry or grieved over what had happened. And there, as you will recall, what Joseph emphasized was, God sent me before you to preserve life, to give you a remnant on the earth, meaning, as he states explicitly, verse 6, the famine. There's a famine in the land, and by Joseph having been sent before, that ensured your survival. But there's an additional dimension. This additional dimension is less immediate, but of far more vast implications. Recall, we have had occasion to note this in the past as well. Genesis chapter 15. God's covenant with Abraham, in the context of which we read, and it came to pass that when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, a dread, even a great darkness fell upon him. And God said to Abram, know of a surety that your seed will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them and be afflicted by them 400 years. The dire implications of the descent to Egypt. As Joseph and his brothers become painfully aware This is the beginning of the fulfillment of this dire prophecy of God to Abraham. But of course, that's not all. And that by itself wouldn't explain God meant it for good. That's good. That's good. And also that nation whom they will serve, I shall judge. And afterward, they shall come out with great substance. What great substance? So, of course, the obvious answer is they came out of Egypt with gold and silver and beautiful clothing. Is that the great substance? Well, to a degree. But then the gold, silver, clothing, that was really just restitution, reparations for all the years of bondage, back pay for all the work that had been unimbursed in the interim. What was really the great substance? Well, what happens immediately after the Exodus? 50 days later, at the feet of Mount Sinai, God reveals His teaching, the Torah, to Israel and by extension to the world. This is great substance. This is great substance that transforms the world. This is the great substance, ultimately, that God meant for good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive, ultimately to save the world, by imparting to the world His teaching, His holy word, the Torah. It all hinged upon Israel being there in bondage and in liberation. In Egypt, going forth from Egypt and receiving what was really the great substance, the Torah. So Joseph, in, if you will, prophetic anticipation, recognizes that everything that had happened heretofore was necessary in order to advance history, the world, toward its divinely ordained conclusion. Now, that, again, undoubtedly is a crucial element in our understanding what's going on here. And I should emphasize further, we noted this in passing last time, that it also helps to highlight what might seem to be a peripheral detail in the narrative way back in Genesis 37, when Jacob sent Joseph on that fateful journey to seek out his brothers. To seek out his brothers where? In Shechem. Except they weren't there. He went out of the valley of Hebron, he came to Shechem, and he found nothing. And Scripture tells us, tantalizingly, and a certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, "What do you seek?" You note the tantalizing inversion here. The man found him, as if the man was sent to be looking for him. Furthermore, wandering in the field, a casual observer would have had no way of knowing whether he was wandering in the field or walking through the field on the way to his destination. Why then the initiated exchange? What are you seeking? And Joseph responds, I seek my brothers. Tell me, where are they feeding the flock? This man is supposed to know? Ah, but he does. The man said, they are departed hence, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. Imagine if Joseph would not have been found by, no, not would not have found, would not have been found by this anonymous man. He would have wandered around Shechem, perhaps for a couple of days, and returned home and said, sorry, Dad, I didn't find them. And all of history would have been completely different. We have an ancient tradition that this anonymous man is in fact a heavenly messenger. Now, whether that means that the man was in fact, unbeknownst to Joseph, an angel, or perhaps a divinely ordained messenger, unbeknownst to the man himself, who may have merely sought to help out, providing navigational instructions, never even realizing the historic significance of the mission with which, unbeknownst to him, he had been vested. One possibility or the other, we have no way of knowing. But the idea, the thought, that this is a divine messenger, unbeknownst to Joseph, perhaps unbeknownst to himself, is further amplifying this message that indeed what unfolded in Shechem and in Dothan, where Joseph actually found his brothers, was not happenstance. It was indeed divinely ordained. And as such, that's how things were meant to be. Because going back to God's covenant with Abraham, this is all part of the scheme unfolding. Again, on the one hand, all of this is stressing this realization, this appreciation that the one who indeed is calling the shots, the one who is the author of the plan, is God. Mind you, we're still going to have to understand, what does that tell us about the responsibility, the burden of the crime on the brothers' shoulders? We're getting back there. But first, to appreciate this idea of a divine plan unfolding in the world. In the song of exaltation of Hannah, mother of the prophet Samuel, in Samuel chapter 2, multiply not exceeding proud talk, let not arrogance come out of your mouth. Don't think you are running the show. You're not. For God is the Lord of knowledge, and by Him actions are weighed. He is the gauge of all things. And He is the Lord of knowledge, knowing all, knowing the plan unfolding in the world that He created. And indeed, as expressed in Jeremiah chapter 32, God is great in counsel and mighty in work. Ultimately, He provides both the counsel and the work. It all comes from Him. And yet, again, where do the brothers and their responsibility figure in all this? God is great in counsel and mighty in work, whose eyes are open upon all the ways of the sons of men, who are doing something, to give everyone according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. Meaning, there is responsibility. That is, God will give each one his due. His due will be determined by his ways and the fruit of his doings. What is this telling us about divine dominion in the world and how we understand events unfolding in this world? Of course, what transparently emerges from the foregoing is that God is the author of it all. And indeed, likewise, in Isaiah chapter 45, an extraordinary prophecy that is addressed to the unborn Cyrus, emperor of Persia, who is a long way into the future. And I can't help but note here, there are those who don't believe in prophecy, who posit that this prophecy could not possibly be ascribed to Isaiah because Isaiah predated Cyrus by so many years. Of course, from our perspective, that doesn't make this prophecy impossible. It merely makes it prophecy. That is, something that can indeed describe that which is not yet actual in the world. This prophecy to Cyrus stresses, I am God and there is none else. Beside me there is no Lord. And I have girded you, Cyrus, though you have not known me. And in the continuation, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I am the Lord who does all these things. It's all coming from God. Similarly, in Amos, roughly contemporaneous with Isaiah, shall the shofar be blown in a city and the people not tremble? Shall evil befall a city and God had not done it? It's all coming from God. He is the source of it all. And in a similar tone of rhetorical question, in the 3rd chapter of Lamentations, who is he that said, and it comes to pass, when God did not command it? Where the obvious answer is, nobody. It's only if God commanded it. Do not out of the mouth of the Most High proceed the evil and the good, it all comes from God. And of course, it's important for us to stress here. Why is it so crucial, of such paramount importance, for us to be affirming this? Because one of the most essential premises of ancient paganism was multiple forces, at the very least, of bifurcation between the source of the good and the source of evil. They were disparate. And perhaps the most crucial innovation of the Torah on a theological plane is stressing there is only one source. There isn't any kind of bifurcation. Source of good, source of evil. In a similar vein, I should stress, and I realize this is a point that we've already had occasion to discuss in other contexts here. When we consider Satan in Hebrew, the Satan, which of course means the instigator, his role is certainly not to be any sort of autonomous being. Rather, in the book of Job, this is tellingly clear, both in chapter 1 and again in chapter 2 in almost the same words. The angels of God came to present themselves before God, and the Satan, Satan, came also among them. And again, chapter 2, the angels of God came to present themselves before God, and Satan came also among them to present himself before God. He's just one of the angels, one of the ministering angels, ministering, as it were, before God, part of the delegated system of divine governance that God established in the world. And Satan, the Satan, is simply part of that. There is no such thing as an autonomous alternative force, because there is no autonomous force other than God and God alone. Now, mind you, the inevitable question that emerges here is, how can we possibly ascribe evil to He who is perfect and the source of all? And while this is inevitably a much longer discussion than we can accommodate this evening, because it's not the primary focus of our discussion this evening, I do want to call our attention again to this verse in Isaiah chapter 45, where God is described parallelly creator of darkness and creator of evil. Darkness parallels evil here. Both, when one considers it, are not presences but absences. Darkness is the absence of light. Evil is the absence of the good, truth, peace. So again, I form light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I can't help but add here, at least in brief, a fascinating observation of Maimonides in his philosophical classic, Guide of the Perplexed. You may recall that back at the beginning of this journey, in Genesis chapter 1, we considered the meaning of the Hebrew root bara, translated as create, and connoting, at least according to most biblical authorities, creation ex nihilo, creation of something, of all things, from nothing. Maimonides proposes that it is because that root, bara, connotes creating from nothing, that here in Isaiah, that root, bore, is employed to describe creating that which is nothing. That which is an absence rather than presence. Creating darkness, which is an absence of light. Creating evil, which is ultimately an absence as well. Closed parentheses. This is not intended in any way to exhaust an understanding of the enigma of our ascribing evil to a divine source. But for our purposes, it will suffice. Because what's crucial for us this evening is to appreciate this essential fact. We ascribe everything to God. There is no other. Again, in the words of Isaiah, I am God, and there is none else. There is no alternative source for something else. Everything comes from God. As expressed again in Lamentations, both the evil and the good. But inevitably, this observation seems to fly in the face of something else that is no less fundamental, axiomatic in the Torah. And that is, we are, all of us, endowed with free will. We choose, and we have responsibility for those choices. As expressed in Deuteronomy chapter 11, behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you listen. The curse, if you don't. And it's up to you to choose. Nothing constrains you. Even more resoundingly, in chapter 30. See, I have set before you this day life and good, and death and evil. And what that indeed means is, I command you this day to love God your Lord, walk in his ways, keep his commandments, statutes, ordinances. Then you shall live and multiply. And it's not. Because it's your choice and nothing constrains you. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. And it's all up to you. Therefore, choose life. Because nothing is constraining you to choose it. It's in your hands. It is, as it were, God is begging you. I've given you the choice to choose well. But it's your choice. It's up to you. Therefore, choose life. That you may live, you and your seed, and you may dwell in the land that God swore unto your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's up to you. Free will. Among the most fundamental premises of the Torah. Because if you don't have free will, you don't have responsibility. You have free will. And you have responsibility. And therefore, in the words of the next to last chapter of Ecclesiastes, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth, and walk in the days of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. You can do whatever you want, because you have free will. But free will is an opportunity. We've discussed this previously. Every opportunity that God gives you is concomitantly a responsibility. Know that through all these things, God will bring you into judgment. Therefore, remove vexation from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, because you're responsible. That is, on the one hand, again, God is the author of the plan, but simultaneously, God gives us completely unfettered free will. What is so extraordinary here is, on the one hand, we affirm so passionately that there is nothing that exists autonomously of God, and therefore God is the source of all things, except that you are endowed, we, each of us, every human being, is endowed with free will that operates autonomously of God, because nothing constrains you to choose. That's why God implores you, choose life, but it's up to you. No one, nothing is going to constrain you. Free moral choice. You have the wherewithal to discern right and wrong. You have the wherewithal, on the one hand, to discern what is truly right, and on the other hand, to delude yourself into embracing as right and good what deep down you know is wrong. And no one, nothing, can possibly prevent you from doing that. It's in your hands. But if it is, then it is. Then how can there be a divine plan over which God exercises unbridled control? How can human free will coexist with a divinely ordained plan? Consider, please, the two verses that follow from Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 16 and Proverbs chapter 19. In chapter 16, verse 9, a man's heart devises his way. It's your free will. Nothing encroaches upon it. Your heart devises your way. But God directs his steps. There is some bottom line conclusion that indeed is under divine dominion. And similarly, chapter 19, verse 21, there are many devices in a man's heart. That, again, is up to you. Each of us, those devices are in our heart and subject to our control. We choose. But the counsel of God, that will stand. So there is this additional dimension as well. You choose. But the final operative consequences of that choice are beyond you. There is a well-known, fairly popular expression among Yiddish speakers that I think is especially apropos here. In Yiddish, somewhat acerbically it goes, Mensch tracht und Gott macht. Man plans. God does. In a somewhat more biting version of the expression, Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. Man plans, God laughs. In the sense, again, of we make the decisions, but the final consequences of those decisions, as they pertain to the divine plan unfolding in the world, those consequences remain in God's domain, not in our hands. To illustrate this with a particularly telling statement in the Bible, in the book of Esther. In chapter 4, once Mordechai has become aware of the royal edict promulgated by Haman to extirpate all the Jews, he bids Esther to come before the king to plead on behalf of her people. And Esther initially is hesitant. She says, with undoubtedly the most sincere, the best of intentions, the king undoubtedly will call me sometime in the coming weeks. If I go uninvited, you may lose your connection to the throne because I might get killed. And Mordechai responds to her concerns with a warning. Think not with yourself that you will escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if you altogether hold your peace at this time, which you can do, because you have free will, like all human beings, and you could choose to do that. But if you do it, then relief and deliverance will arise to Jews from elsewhere. You may ask, how do they know? But again, the premise in the statement, as we well understand, is as for the ultimate ramifications in the divine plan, the Lord directs the steps, the counsel of the Lord, that will stand. And so, as for the divine plan, don't you worry, even if you don't do what is bidden of you. Relief and deliverance will arise to the Jews from elsewhere. What is in your hands, however, is, if you do that, you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you are come to royal estate for such a time as this. Now, if we could begin considering the statement out of order from the end. Who knows whether you are coming to royal estate for such a time as this? Who knows? In definitive terms, no one knows. We don't know what divinely ordained mission is the reason that we were brought into this world. But we affirm that we were brought into this world with a divinely ordained mission. Many of you may recall I've made this point in the past, but I think it bears noting again here. We can characterize the essential difference between theism, believing in God, and atheism without even mentioning God's name, which might be useful because, after all, how many people, when they talk about God, really know what they're talking about? But the essential difference between theism and atheism can just as well be described by asking, Is life intrinsically meaningful or not? I emphasize the word intrinsically here. Undoubtedly, atheists can, and one would hope generally do, choose to dedicate their lives to any number of worthy causes. Sure, they can. Nothing prevents them from doing so, but intrinsically, life is meaningless. Because if one is an atheist, then one is constrained to posit that life itself arose by chance. There was no purposeful intelligence involved in your coming into this world. For the theist, who posits the existence of an intelligent creator, your existence, the existence of each and every one of you, of every human being, is not chance, but rather a purposeful act of divine creation. You have a mission for which you're put into the world. And the tantalizing implication of what Mordechai states here is, there is divine plan. You are given a mission to discharge in the advancement of that plan. But that divine plan does not depend exclusively upon your fulfilling your mission. The divine plan is authored by God and God alone, and it will advance toward its conclusion. So therefore, again, if you hold your peace at this time, as for the divine plan, the relief and deliverance will arise from elsewhere. But you had a mission for the world. You were put here for a reason. And if you shirk that God-given responsibility, then you and your father's house will perish. The plan will advance. Just you'll be destroyed. That is to say, we, each of us, have a choice. We can choose to ally ourselves with God's plan, to do our utmost to advance that plan toward its blessed conclusion by doing God's works as He guides us and as He has charged us. And by so doing, we will indeed advance the divine plan toward its conclusion and concomitantly attain our own personal salvation in the process. Alternatively, we also can, if we so choose, do our utmost to thwart God's plan, to actively oppose it in whatever way we can. And by so doing, we, too, will advance God's plan toward its final destination. The difference is that if we choose the latter course, we will destroy ourselves in the process. The divine plan will advance. It is we who will be destroyed as a result. That is indeed up to us. So we can choose. We can choose freely whether to save ourselves or destroy ourselves. We will be advancing the divine plan toward its ultimate conclusion regardless, which is really another way of saying you can choose to be good or bad. You cannot choose to be insignificant or irrelevant. Since you are put into this world as a result of a divine act of creation, you are significant. You are relevant. You will be advancing the divine plan. Just the mode, how you will advance the divine plan, that indeed is up to you. To consider this in a subtle allusion of the text in Deuteronomy chapter 22, the Torah tells us, when you build a new house, then you shall make a parapet, a railing for your roof. Why? Well, the answer should be pretty obvious. If there's no railing around the roof, people could fall off. So you are required, this is a mitzvah, a commandment, to make a parapet, a railing for the roof, that you not bring a liability of blood upon your house. Now, standard translations read, if any man, anyone, falls from it. Yeah, but in the actual Hebrew we read, ki pol hanofel mimenu, which literally translates to, if the faller falls from it. The faller falls from it? Why are you calling him a faller? He hasn't fallen yet. Once he's fallen, you can say he's a faller. In the meantime, he's just a man. Why the faller falls from it? The subtle implication that he is a faller has already been decreed. As expressed in Isaiah chapter 41. Who has wrought and done it? He who called the generations from the beginning. I, the Lord, who am the first and with the last am the same. God called the generations from the beginning. God decreed, for whatever set of reasons, it's not relevant for the discussion here, that this individual is a faller. So you might think, well, if God already decided he's a faller, why should I bother making a railing? Let him fall. It's God's decision, after all. It's not mine. No, it's yours. If you have a roof and you don't make a railing, you are liable for his falling, even though that fall ultimately is divine decree. In our tradition, we have an ancient expression for expressing this idea, that God rolls merit into the world through meritorious people. And he rolls liability into the world through liable people. Now note, then, that ultimately the one who's doing the rolling is God, both the merit and the liability. Everyone, in choosing one role or the other, is simply choosing what role to play. Will you be a means for bringing merit into the world or liability into the world? The actual decision as to how and whatever comes into the world, that's God's. But you choose to be an instrument of merit or of liability. To express it in the terms of a fairly recondite verse in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 10. You may find widely disparate translations of this verse because the Hebrew is somewhat ambiguous and it is open to interpretation. The translation I'm employing here, which is certainly perfectly consistent with the Hebrew, is, great is he who performs all. And we, of course, know who that is. He with a capital H. Great is he, God, who performs all. And in doing all, he hires the fool and he hires transgressors. Meaning, God is, as it were, the great playwright of the world. And all of human history is that colossal, divine drama unfolding in the world. And as such, God writes the script, and he casts the characters, and everyone has a role to play in the drama. Again, of course, everyone has a role to play because everyone is significant. Everyone is here as a result of a divine act of creation. And therefore, everyone is going to play some role in that vast drama and advancing it to its final conclusion, including the fool, including transgressors. God's hiring everybody. But again, the difference. If you choose the path of merit, then God rolls merit into the world through you. And for you, the more crucial implication is, as a result, you are sustained. You are saved. If one chooses to be an instrument of liability, then one will indeed succeed in being an instrument of liability. Because God also rolls liability into the world, and He employs to that end the fool and the transgressors who have chosen the path of liability. But by so doing, one destroys oneself. The divine plan advances regardless. But we do have free will, truly free. And through our exercise of that free will, we freely choose and determine whether we will be, by consequence, saved or destroyed by our own choices. So, to return to our starting point, again, there is a divine plan. But simultaneously, there is free will. The two principles are indeed coexistent. The divine plan determines what will be. Free will determines what our choices are, and thus the roles that we play in the advancement of the divine plan toward its final conclusion. Which inevitably brings us back to our opening question. So what about Joseph's brothers? And of course, by implication, what about all of us? Why indeed should Joseph console his brothers, reassure them that everything is okay? They committed a terrible transgression. They sinned. What they did was evil. Yes, but here we need to recall yet again what we noted in chapter 50 regarding the actions of the brothers, and in particular, the textual ambiguity that pertained to what they had done. And here I'm going to focus on the alternative translation because I think it's critical. And as for you, you considered me evil against you. You hadn't chosen to do evil, but you had reached the conclusion, as we discussed a couple of sessions ago, that I was not merely a threat to you, that I was jeopardizing the entire spiritual mission of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That if I were to succeed, the entire spiritual legacy could be compromised or destroyed. And as a result, you concluded that it was an act of spiritual self-defense to eliminate me, or at the very least, to get me far, far away. Because you considered me evil against you. So, you reached a conclusion. The conclusion, in retrospect, you recognize now was wrong. But at the time, based upon the information available to you, you sincerely believed that it was correct. Well, under such circumstances, you hadn't chosen the path of liability to be an instrument of bringing liability into the world. You sincerely sought to choose the path of merit. And as a result, through your choice, unbeknownst to you, indeed unfathomable to you, you did bring merit into the world. God meant it for good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive, to set in motion an extraordinary dynamism, at the culmination of which God's Torah is revealed to humanity when the nation of Israel emerges from Egypt after all those years and all those travails. And ultimately, even though in the interim, in the short order, everything seems so bad, everything seems like liability is rolling into the world because of people being liable. In fact, it was merit coming into the world because of your merit. You became an instrument in God's plan, advancing toward its conclusion for the good. The implications, of course, for each and every one of us. We too are continuously presented with choices. No one would or could fault us for not having access to unlimited information. We have only the information that's available to us. The challenge is, with the information that is available to us, how are we choosing? Are we choosing well, or are we choosing badly? Are we choosing actively to ally ourselves with God's plan? Actively to advance that plan toward its ultimate conclusion by doing God's works as He has commanded us, as He guides us, as He shows us the way. Because to the extent that we do, we are assured that all that we do will indeed not be for naught. It will not be in vain. It will not be futile. It will contribute to the world advancing toward its final God-given conclusion. Should we choose otherwise, we will still be advancing the world toward its final God-given conclusion, but destroying ourselves in the process. So long as we know that we are doing our utmost to ally ourselves actively with God's plan and advance it as He shows us the way, we know that we are contributing both to the redemption of the world and to the redemption and salvation of ourselves. May we indeed have the insight and dedication and perseverance and fortitude to choose well, and thus to, by whatever actions we undertake, whatever choices that we make, serve as the means for God, meaning it for good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Amen. God bless you.